Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to get session 2 underway, which is a discussion of the strategic outlook in the Asia-Pacific region. And we have a stellar panel who will each make a 10-minute or so presentation before we get into discussion around strategic events. The first speaker is Professor Ben Schreer, who's the head of the Department of Security Studies and Criminology at Macquarie University. Ben rather shamelessly defected from ASPI to take up that position. He'd been with us for a number of years, and before that the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU. Ben has written widely on Asia-Pacific security issues, including on Japanese and Indonesian military developments, on Taiwan, most recently for us, on the air-sea battle concept and Australian defence policy. Dr. Amy King is a lecturer in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the ANU. Her research focuses on the China-Japan relationship, Chinese foreign and security policy, and the international relations and security of the Asia-Pacific region. Amy is very soon to have a book published with Cambridge University Press, which examines the post-World War II rebuilding of economic ties between the People's Republic of China and Japan. I discovered yesterday the book is now available for pre-order, and I commend it to you. CambridgeUniversityPress.com, I guess, Amy. David Irvine really doesn't need an introduction to this audience, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He's had a distinguished career as a diplomat and a senior official. He was Director General of Security, otherwise known as the head of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation from March of 2009 to September 2014. He was Director General of the Australian Secret Intelligence Service from 2003 to 2009. David has also served as Australian High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea 96 to 99 when I first met David, and he's also been Ambassador to China from the year 2000 to 2003. So I'll ask each speaker to talk for roughly 10 minutes or so and then into conversation. Ben, over to you.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thanks for inviting me back despite having defected. There was a lot of praise about the white paper this morning, and of course never in my life will I deviate from that position, but I thought I'd use my German subtlety to ask a few questions and make a few maybe mildly critical remarks. The white paper identifies 6 key drivers that will shape Australia's environment. 1, the US-Sino relationship. 2nd, challenge to the rules-based order. 3rd, state fragility. 4th, terrorism. 5th, force modernization trends, and 6, cyber. I will focus on 3 of them, and the first one is the US-Sino strategic relationship, which was, in terms of its importance, also mentioned already this morning by the Minister and the opposition spokesman. Of course, I would never criticize that. How can you contest the notion that the US-Sino relationship and how it plays out will really be fundamental? But I think the white paper might actually be a little bit too optimistic in how this relationship is going to play out. What the white paper says is basically it assumes that twin relationship between cooperation on the one hand and competition on the other hand will continue. And we all, of course, hope that. And it optimistically states that, quote, major conflict is unlikely. And what we will see at the most are, quote, points of frictions in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And I would think, or I would suggest that that might be a little bit too optimistic, because China quite clearly is now changing the regional order. It is challenging the United States, US strategic position, and it is making a quest for at least a sub-regional hegemony. And it is trying to rewrite the rules, and in some cases it is, quite frankly, already rewriting the rules, or at least trying to change the rules into its favors. And I think the very fact that there is still quite a degree of uncertainty about the US rebalance demonstrates that the region is still anxious, and maybe in some cases even more anxious, about whether the United States will be able and willing to, well, stand up and to this challenge as part of a broader coalition. In my view, regardless of who wins the US presidential election, China will continue to push through a variety of coercive means. It will continue to push the United States into accepting what you might call mutually exclusive spheres of influence. And the island-building strategy that we're currently seeing in the South China Sea is but one element in that strategy. So for the United States, that means it can either accept China's claims or it contests them. My assumption is that it's rather likely that the United States will push back. If it pushes back, however, there will be a much higher degree of competition and potentially even conflict. And major conflict over Taiwan or the Senkaku Diaju Island, in my view, is at least not impossible. And even if we are not seeing such a high level of conflict, and we all hope that that's not going to happen, if the United States pushes back against China, that will lead to the creation of contested, overlapping spheres of influence in the South China Sea and parts of the East China Sea. If that happens, we might actually face increasing difficult trade-offs in the US-Chinese relationship. Australia, in my view, and I'm talking on the assumption that we're talking about a security environment out to 2035, might therefore be faced with the implication of a much higher degree of US-Sino competition and confrontation. And where do we fit in that spectrum? Secondly, I want to focus a little bit on the emphasis on the challenges for the rules-based order, which, as everyone knows in this room, is the term which is mentioned the most in the white paper. The white paper only talks about challenges to the global rules-based order. I would have wished that it would also have explicitly mentioned that this is also very much about challenges to the regional rules-based order, but if you then read the document, it's quite clear that this is what we're actually talking about. I think the reality that we're facing over the next 2 decades is the reality that there will be a decline of the regional liberal order. And it is not just China that challenges this order, it's also Russia, but I would encourage you to think broader than that, because if you're looking at certain policies that you see coming out of India, developments in Turkey, developments in Brazil, but also when you look at the European continent, if you look at what's happening in Hungary or Poland, these are all regimes that contest the liberal world order and that to some extent try to develop parallel institutions that have different interpretation of international law or that resort to unilateral actions. The white paper seems to be rather ambivalent. I think on the one hand it senses that end of an illusion that China in this case will not contest the regional order, but on the other hand it hopes that the rules-based order can still prevail. In some paragraph it talks about the fact that rising powers had, quote, a responsibility to adhere to those norms and rules of behavior. Those emerging powers might well ask, why? Why? Who are you to tell us that we have to abide by those norms? And I think we might have to come to terms with the fact that the rules-based order, at least the liberal rules-based order, might face much, much greater limitations, and that balancing and other more classical mechanisms of international affairs could again become much more prominent. I still think that mentioning the rules-based order so many times serves a number of useful purposes. It clearly identifies China as the major challenge to the order, while of course at the same time not identifying China as an enemy, which clearly it is not. In my view, it is an attempt to shape China's behavior. And I think we can also say that it is not about a China choice for Australia, but very much about China's choice, in the sense that the more China pushes the envelope, the higher the pressure on other nations to respond. And that includes in Australia. And my view is that the Defence White Paper is very clear what the response would be. And the focus on the importance of the rules-based order provides a perfect rationale to intensify our alliance with the United States, intensify our relationship with Japan and other partners. In that sense, I think it is really important to also underline that Southeast Asia and strategic relationship in that space must simply become a priority. I mean, the minister this morning talked about it being the DNA of the white paper in terms of strategic relationships. I think there is much, much bolder thinking required beyond that in terms of how to implement all of this. And one of the key relationships is, of course, Indonesia. Can we, for instance, think about a quasi-alliance with Indonesia in 2030? Something which is probably to many in the rooms unthinkable today, but I would be very surprised if this relationship, who has such great potential, would be, would still be the same in 2025, 2030, and can we start thinking about further developing it now? And that also goes for a number of other relationships, because in Southeast Asia, how Southeast Asian countries respond to China's challenge is even more rapidly becoming more pressing. The Southeast Asian countries actually are right in the eye of the storm. I think as our Indonesian colleagues, Malaysian, Vietnamese, Philippine colleagues can attest, the pressure of China is intense. And I noted with great interest the interview last week in the Wall Street Journal by the Singaporean Prime Minister, who let himself quoted to the extent that it was better that the United States was continue to writing the rules than China. He explicitly stated that, and that's quite a significant statement coming out of Singapore. Last point, and then I stop, military modernization and the need to maintain technological superiority. I think the question that we should ask ourselves is the maintenance of that technological edge that has been a mantra of Australian defence policy for many, many decades. Is it either possible and is it actually necessary in the future? When we are talking about maintaining that edge, I think what we are implicitly saying is this is about a potential conflict with a Southeast Asian country. Surely we are not benchmarking ourselves against a major power, but that might actually prevent us from developing that much more meaningful, substantial partnership in the region with a number of countries. So I would pose it as a question going forward: does the ADF always have to be the best in all of those capability areas? And I think I leave it here. Sorry for going over.
No, Ben, thank you. Some very interesting points. Amy, over to you.
Thank you. Good to be with you all today, and thank you to Peter for the plug of the book. So clearly the Defence White Paper reflects a regional order that is changing, and it goes in some way, as Ben has discussed, to talking about some of the drivers of that change, and sort of at the heart of that clearly is the rise of China. And all of that is having implications for Australia's relationships with major powers in the region. I want to spend a little bit of time talking today about the place that Japan has in the Defence White Paper, because it's something I was sort of surprised by. I think given the trajectory of the Australia-Japan relationship, particularly over the last 3 years, I was surprised that Japan did not have greater prominence in the White Paper. Of course, a number of the developments with Japan are mentioned, the recent high-level agreements in defence logistics and science and technology, greater bilateral cooperation on military exercises, trilateral cooperation with the United States, cooperation on the Joint Strike Fighter. But Japan is much less prominent in the white paper than we might have expected, given a lot of the language around Japan as a best friend, an ally, strategic partner that we heard from Tony Abbott, particularly between 2013 and 2015. Instead, Japan features alongside a host of other regional security partners. It's almost always listed alongside Korea, Singapore, India, China, Indonesia, as one of a number of close regional security partners for Australia. And Australia and New Zealand, for that matter, take far greater prominence in the white paper. So there is, I guess, an emerging, perhaps, asymmetry now in the way in which Australia views its relationship with Japan and the way that Japan views its relationship with Australia. The Japanese government, after all, has described Australia as its second most important security partner after the United States. That's not necessarily the impression one would get from reading the Australian Defence White Paper. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, I think there's an important distinction in this white paper about how Australia views the future regional security order and perhaps how it's viewed in Japan. As Ben sort of alluded to before, Australia talks about the global order and the regional order in slightly different ways. It talks about the global order and the United States retaining leadership of that global order as being in our key interests. But when we get to the regional level, Australia says only that it welcomes the United States playing a critical role in the region, not a leading role, but a critical role. And that's where I think we start to differ with Japan, because over the last few years, Japan's Abe government has instituted a whole host of new security bills, new legislation, revising of the US-Japan defence guidelines, which are all designed to strengthen the US-led order in Asia, to strengthen the US-Japan alliance as a key fundamental sort of underpinning of that order, but to lock in the existing US-led order in Asia. And I'm not sure that that's exactly what Australia has envisaged in this defence white paper. Instead, I think we see China playing a greater role potentially. Certainly the white paper talks about China having the capacity to play a greater role, that China will seek greater influence. The white paper is certainly very critical of aspects of China's behaviour, particularly in maritime disputes in recent years, and around issues around defence transparency, things that have been mentioned in the past. But it does allow for the possibility of China playing a greater role in terms of the regional order. And so this is where I start to see some space between Australia and Japan, and I think that's an important thing for us to consider. The Defence White Paper clearly clings very strongly to this idea of the rules-based order, as we've already heard. And that's an important phrase that's used throughout the White Paper, and Australia is signalling that we are critical of some recent behaviour by not only China but others, perhaps in trying to change that rules-based order. But I think it does suggest that a range of countries can have a role in shaping that rules-based order. The rules themselves perhaps are not laid out as explicitly as they might be. This idea of a rules-based order is often used as kind of a proxy term, but it's actually the content of those rules that we need to know more about. And that's something that is really evolving in Asia at the moment. And that's something I think, in terms of taking the white paper from the page to reality, is where we need to go next, in terms of working with regional partners, with China, Japan, the United States, Indonesia, and others, to work out what the rules of this new changing order should be. I think it's very significant that Australia places so much attention on Southeast Asia and maritime disputes in the white paper, because clearly these are areas of interest for Australia. We do have concerns about where those maritime disputes are going, and the white paper makes clear that China's behaviour in particular is of concern. I think that's very important. Too often, when I sort of speak with Chinese interlocutors, I think they view Australia's interests and those of other smaller countries in the region as viewing maritime disputes solely through the lens of the US alliance, as if our interests were just what the US sort of told us to say. I think it's very, very important that Australia makes clear that we have our own interests, whether it be freedom of shipping or anything else. So that's an important element of the white paper. But of course we need to go beyond that. There are more rules in this order than just these maritime disputes. So working out what these new rules are, giving major powers like China a say in shaping those rules is important, because whether we like it or not, China will have greater influence. But recognising that this rules-based order is not static. It hasn't been static since 1945. It has evolved. It had to evolve when Japan emerged and arose. When Japan created things like the Asian Development Bank in the 1960s, the region, the United States, was deeply uncomfortable about this. And so the region had to evolve to make room for a rising power like Japan. That's now happening in the case of China as well. I think the dilemma, of course, is in thinking for Australia about how to pursue this sort of new regional order to think about what these rules are, is whether how we communicate these interests and who we have these conversations with. Clearly, Australia and Japan have moved closer together in security terms over the last few years, and the Australia-China relationship is also evolving. In the past, Australia could pursue its relationship with China and its relationship with Japan pretty unilaterally, and we didn't really have to think about the relationship between those two countries all that much. That is changing, and the competition between those two countries means that what we do with one country inevitably gets interpreted by the other. So I think it's very, very important that Australia makes very clear what our interests are. And I don't think our interests are competition between China and Japan, an unhealthy relationship between China and Japan. It is vitally important not only to our economic prosperity, but also to the economic prosperity of the wider region, that a healthy relationship exists between China and Japan. We need to make it clear to them that they need to work together to work out what a mutually beneficial strategic order looks like. And that's incredibly difficult. I'm not underestimating the difficulty of that challenge. China does not see a place for Japan in its new model of major power relations. And Japan is increasingly unwilling to think of China as playing a greater leading role in the region. Japan is in a particularly difficult position. The United States wants Japan to do more. China does not believe it's legitimate for Japan to do more. So Japan is in a very difficult position. But for a country like Australia, we depend on a healthy relationship between these major powers. And I think it's absolutely imperative for us to make clear that is our key interest. So I'll stop there. And yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting indeed. And I want to, during the Q&A, come back to the treatment of Japan in the white paper, which I thought you made some very interesting points. Finally, David, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. I don't have a lot of quibbles with the white paper's analysis of the regional strategic situation per se. It clearly identifies the importance of the region to us, although interestingly, in terms of the names of this conference and the paper, we need, I think, a lot more to be conceptually thinking about Indo-Pacific, the concept, because India is obviously going to be very, very important to us. The key thing that strikes me and continues to strike me over 40 years in this business has simply been the historic centrality of the United States in ensuring what peace and stability and certainly the prosperity that we've managed to achieve in this region over a very long period of time. It's been a key regional dynamic. Providing security guarantees, markets, technology, finance for the development of the region. It's been a stabilising factor in terms of the guarantees that freed, for example, Korea and Japan from the need to go nuclear. It's been extremely helpful for the development of a key regional organisation, key for Australia, in the development of ASEAN, and indeed the emergence for a time of the importance of the leadership role of Indonesia. And when you boil it all down, it has also actually been a key element in the rise of China, particularly since the end of the Cultural Revolution, whereby the peace and stability that the Americans in one way or another were able to deliver to the region enabled China to begin to realise its economic potential and growing prosperity. As one has been sort of working in this area for a long time, you know, we in terms of Australian diplomacy spent a huge effort, first of all in developing relations with ASEAN, because we saw it as so important that there be a stable immediate region, and ASEAN was a terrific fillip to that, first of all solving their own internal problems and then being a relatively stable area to our immediate north. So that was hugely important. But then also the whole concept of developing a regional architecture, a sort of a cooperative architecture within the region to manage regional security issues. And over the time, as you know, it all developed. A lot of it focused around ASEAN itself, the ASEAN +3, the East Asian Summit, the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting, and all of those elements at regional self-help in creating security within our area. And of course, in the economic area, APEC. So we've spent a lot of time working on those things, and they still exist, and they're still, to my mind, very important. But this architecture is still incomplete. The decisions of those sorts of groups are non-binding, and as we see in the developments in the South China Sea, a regional architecture is clearly not as successful at solving regional issues as we would like. It hasn't really been successful yet either in promoting the greater collaboration I think we need to see, particularly in the Southeast Asian region, in combating terrorism. Although the countries of the region have made great strides in that area, we're not there yet. Regional architecture of any sort has had absolutely no impact whatsoever on the little matter of the DPRK. And indeed, if that problem is going to be solved, it's not going to be solved, I think, from within the region per se at the moment, but rather with international efforts that are including the use of sanctions, that may or may not make a difference, but they haven't made much of a difference yet. So we're dealing with a region where, quite clearly in the white paper, in its nice diplomatic way, points this out. We're dealing with a region where we have the rise of China. Now, yeah, of course, it's a truism that China represents opportunities and challenges and so on. I once spent a lot of time debating the word challenge with a senior PLA general who thought I was actually slapping him in the face and we're going to have a duel next morning. But it is a challenge, and there's no doubt about it. And the fact is that we are now seeing, and frankly earlier than I thought we would be seeing, a much more assertive, abrasive China that appears to want to establish the ascendancy of its particular worldview on the region. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and we are going to have to learn to cope with that sort of approach. It's not a bad thing provided that China obtains levels of regional support, is prepared to accommodate the interests of regional countries, and contains its tendency towards exceptionalism. And so the One Belt, One Road policy makes sense to China, and it frankly makes sense in terms of world trade and a lot of other things. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization makes sense to China, and it's not necessarily something that is particularly inimical to our interests. And of course, I personally welcome Chinese creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But the fact is that China's more assertive policies in the region and the manner with which it's pursuing them is raising very legitimate concerns about the strategic order and the stability of our region. It's presenting new crunch points, new frictions and new tensions. And as both my colleagues here on the platform have said, China's adherence to a rules-based order is selective, in accordance with the exceptionalism that traditionally characterises great powers and certainly is characterising China at the moment. And one of the things that really worries me is that we've seen the way in which China is quite content to neuter the existing regional security architecture when it suits its purposes, and the South China Sea is a classic example. And it doesn't, to me, seem overly concerned about losing the confidence of its neighbours or causing them real worry. Now, the white paper, quite while appropriately diplomatic, obviously doesn't shy away from expressing regional concerns about the increased assertiveness of China in the region, particularly as that assertiveness is accompanied by a growing military capability, that which, while not yet assessed to be the equivalent to, or even getting near the equivalent to, the United States, is certainly a really potent regional force. So what's been the response of the region? And the fact is that the regional architecture hasn't worked, and we are left relying once again on the centrality of the role of the United States in the region to help contribute to the stability of our area. And in fact, after all those efforts at regional architecture, we're still reliant on good old great power relationships and how they get on, and the US-China relationship and how that is going to be managed. And the white paper clearly acknowledges the strategic importance of that. There are all sorts of answers to that question. I don't know how many of you have read Kevin Rudd's paper, which he produced, I think, sometime last year, advocating essentially that China and the United States should work together to get along and strengthen an order against those forces, political, climatic, biological, and so on, that would destroy us all together. In other words, we all have and China and the United States really have a great interest in learning to work together. Now, that's a great aspiration, but the extent to which it's going to be realised in the immediate future is a little bit more open to question. And so all of this leads me, as I say, to conclude that the United States is necessarily going to have to play a dominant role in the region. It is going to continue to be central to the peace and security of our region, and I suspect also in large part to the prosperity of it. But if US commitment wanes, as we were worried for a time it was waning under President Obama, or if it does something drastically more than wane under a triumphant President Trump, if he, for example, were elected and actually followed through with his pronouncements during the primaries, and he would totally overturn the Asia-Pacific apple cart, i.e. with a nuclear Japan or a nuclear Korea, and they've got to pay for it all, all that sort of thing, then clearly the foundation of Asia-Pacific security is going to have been turned on its head. Now, we can all use those thoughts to guide the support that we lend to particular candidates in the US campaign. But in those circumstances, obviously, this white paper, its provisions, current provisions, will be more necessary than ever, but it's likely to be insufficient. And so the point being that, my final point is simply this: we are dependent, I think, regional security is going to be dependent on an active role in the United States in the region for a considerable time to come. And if that role wanes, then in many ways a lot of bets are off.
David, thank you. Well, some very interesting provocations there, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm going to exercise the moderator's right to ask the first question, but Ben says to us the white paper was too optimistic on US and China, that in fact it reflects the end of an illusion that China is prepared to play according to some notion of the rules. Amy talks with some surprise about how Japan didn't get a more prominent role, and that they may indeed be an asymmetry of view between Canberra and Tokyo in terms of thinking about the bilateral relationship. David rightly points to India, which we really should talk a little bit about in the next hour or so, and the very evident failure of regional architecture. I'm also left thinking, David, and this is not an original observation, that so many of the references to rule of law really are references to the exercise of power in the form of the United States in this part of the world. The question that I wanted to put, and maybe it's to Ben and Amy because you've anticipated the Donald, just to get some liveliness going before I turn to the audience for questions. Our white paper was 2 years in the making. The Chinese were barely pouring concrete in the South China Sea when we started. We certainly didn't anticipate Donald Trump. Perhaps that can be characterised as an intelligence failure, David. But I was struck when my colleague Patrick Walters interviewed the New York Times correspondent Jane Perlez for the ASPI strategist. Jane is based in Beijing, one of the New York Times most senior correspondents. The question was, what do you think is the biggest threat to security in the Asia Pacific? And the two-word answer was Donald Trump. So would you agree, Ben and Amy, with that assessment? And if so, what do we do about it? Ben?
Well, what do we do about it? We pray. We pray a lot, and we hope that in the end, well, I have great faith in the American people and in the American electorate, even though I'm far from claiming to understand how it exactly works. I mean, let's assume the nightmare scenario. Let's assume Donald Trump becomes the legitimate president of the United States.
You were searching for a word that was stronger than nightmare.
Yes. Well, let's assume that happens. Then we still have the hope that a president comes into office and gets a lot of briefings, and hopefully considers some of the the hopeful recommendations in those briefings, saying, among other things, that it is central for the United States to remain involved in world affairs, not just Asia, but also Europe and the Middle East. Let's assume he thinks that these briefings are completely useless, and he decides to do what he said he did, which is, yeah, David is right, we need to have a stronger word than a nightmare. If that happens, I think, well, there is a huge power vacuum. The security dilemma will increase drastically. I think countries such as Japan, but also a lot of Southeast Asian countries, and quite frankly Australia, will start thinking, Jesus Christ, what does that mean? We really haven't, we have no insurance policy for this. And unlike Japan, we probably can't go nuclear as quickly. But in my view, the region would really be in a dire strait, and probably a lot of those assumptions, as David already said, of the white paper, we would have to write a new one very quickly, and that defense acquisition process that we talked about in the previous session better be even faster than envisaged. But it is really difficult in terms of an intellectual, as an intellectual exercise, to thinking about how, if the cornerstone of Australia's security is removed within, say, 6 to 12 months, what do we do? Can you really think in these alternatives, and if so, how do they look like?
We won't be able to spend 2 years on another white paper, I guess. Now, Amy, I'm guessing that even in manuscript form, Mr. Trump probably hasn't read your forthcoming book with Cambridge University. What are your thoughts on Trump?
So Trump's views particularly on Japan and Korea, are weirdly stuck in the 1980s. And he's still talking about, the sorts of debates about, Japan as number one, Japan as a trade threat to the United States, things that we haven't heard for a few decades now. So that itself is quite curious. And I think clearly a Trump presidency would have huge implications for the US-Japan alliance. in terms of expecting Japan to do more, potentially, the nuclear developments. Although I think on the Japanese side there are enormous domestic and institutional barriers to that. On the Chinese side, though, and interestingly, I'm quoting here from 3 of China's leading scholars who were in town last night, speaking about China and international security. And Yen Shui-tong, one of the most prominent of these, said whether it's a Trump or a Clinton presidency, China probably will continue to do more or less what it is doing right now. I mean, the character of the US presidency is unlikely to change China's behaviour, and I think that's probably right. So, yes, it will matter in terms of the ANZUS alliance and those sorts of things, as Ben has said, but I think it is unlikely to change the character of China all that much.
Now, I'd like to go to questions, ladies and gentlemen. I had a colleague who's now behind me. I'll come to you, Ambassador, next. Sorry, you've moved. Yes, well, you first, then I'll go to Ambassador Nagami. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peter Jennings. My name is Andre Sirgar. I'm the Indonesian consul in Darwin, and let me congratulate you for hosting this very, very timely event. And it's good how you provided the discussions from an academic, from Ben, and from a bilateral perspective for Amy, and also finally to use a regional perspective. This white paper for Indonesia is very, very important. And we from Darwin have been, the consulate in Darwin have been observing. You might know, since 2 years now, we've been reestablishing the military cooperations with coordinated patrols, and also the Air Force is back in cooperation, and maybe in September there'll be more defense army cooperation. But I like the comment by Mr. Ben Schreer regarding the idea of this quasi-relation in 2035. And for us in the Northern Territory, our friends, when we see Asia, it's closer compared to how Canberrians and the South friends here look to Asia, which is 4 hours away. And for me at the consulate, I'm wondering, Asia is moving very, very fast, and I'm wondering what the federal government is looking at Asia like. And probably what we were thinking was, Ben Schreer, could there be a diplomacy of proximity between Indonesia and Australia in engaging this new Asian century? So I'm hoping you can enlighten us more about your quasi-relations. And finally, I think my other question to Amy perhaps is, what do you think is the hindrance really for the defense thinkers in Australia to really engage Asia? Because in the past, we in Asians are suspicious of Australia because you might be representing Europe, and maybe Australia was suspicious of Asia. But today, as Your Honour mentioned, David, that with the many, many treaties like the Lombok Treaty, we've all passed that. But now we have a situation in the region. It's so dynamic that we're waiting now for Australia. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to rely only on Australia, the US, or can we have something for a greater partnership? And what's holding you back? We've been waiting for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andre. Ben.
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, my assumption is that if Indonesia hopefully continues to grow at that remarkable speed that it has, and also develops a more capable defense force for expeditionary operation, then it is in Australia's best interest to finally realize that potential of closer relations that we constantly keep talking about. When the minister spoke about DNA this morning in terms of the strategic relations, I thought, okay, but there's also a DNA of embedded somewhat mistrust, between the two countries, and how do we overcome that? But I struggle to see how in an environment out to 2025, 2030, where the rules and the rules-based order might look very different, and where more often than not the larger powers are rewriting the rules according to how they see fit, because we might actually well fail to strike that new compromise and consensus that Amy so rightly has demanded. In that sense, I think that from an Australian-Indonesia perspective, we require radical new thinking and how we want this relationship to move forward. And from an Australian point of view, having Indonesia there as as an aircraft carrier, if you will, a geostrategic aircraft carrier to what's happening in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia would be critical. But that demands new thinking. and then to say, oh, we have a strategic partnership and we do a little bit of here and we do a little bit of patrolling here and we do a little bit of exchange there and we learn a language. That's all fine, and I realize that this is important to start somewhere, but I think we need to have that bigger push. Whether Indonesia would be willing to do that, you're in a much better position. I would want to hear from the current, president of Indonesia what these terms also mean and these concepts that he's putting forward, in terms of the maritime strategy, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks for the question. I completely agree. I think there is a perception in the region that the region's been waiting for Australia for a long time. Sometimes that's unfair as a perception. I think, Australia was at the forefront of really good efforts to tie the region together economically, one of the first countries to reach out in military security terms to China, Japan and others. But yeah, I think you're right that we often swing closer to our US alliance and we think of the region solely through the lens of the US alliance. And if this is a region in which that order is changing, and that those rules are changing and we need to come up with that new consensus, it's really imperative that Australia works with countries like Indonesia and others in the region who face exactly the same kinds of challenges that we do. We often talk as if it's only Australia that has the US as our ally and China as our major economic partner. That's true for just about every other country in the region, ally of the US or not. We would be very well placed to talk more with regional small and middle powers about and increasingly large powers like Indonesia about how they view the region and what some of the new regional rules should be.
Go to Ambassador Nagami from Japan.
Yoshi Nagami, JIA, President of JIA. One question to Dr. Schreer and another question to Dr. King. First, Dr. Schreer, you mentioned about the rules-based order. I think everybody has been talking about it. But when one talks about, for instance, in Japan or in the United States, we normally add adjective called liberal. The liberal rules-based order or rules-based liberal democratic order. What's the difference between rules, this reference in this white paper, and the liberal democratic rules-based order? That was my question. Second question to Dr. King. Everybody talks about the importance of the U.S. presence here in the Asia-Pacific region. But the white paper doesn't talk about the legal basis for U.S. physical presence in the Asia-Pacific region. That is U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, the basis for the U.S. forward deployment. And the importance of, what is the reason why you talked about underestimation of Japan's role, but I would say underestimation of U.S.-Japan security treaty role in the region, providing or the basis for the physical presence of the U.S. forces in this region.
Ben, let's start with you.
Well, that is a really tough question. I give it my best shot. Will probably fail. Well, I think you're right. When you read the white paper, it doesn't say liberals rules-based order. It doesn't have that adjective. But when you then actually read what the white paper expresses in terms of its hope, how this rules-based order will continue to look like, it's quite clear that what they have in mind is a liberal rules-based order. I think when you look at this from a Chinese perspective or from a Russian perspective, you say, well, rules-based is enough. And I think if you see how the Chinese and the Russians and others have argued in the context of Syria, in the context of Libya, in the context also the Chinese in the South China Sea, they're going back to more traditional ideas about rules and international norms and non-interference in sovereign states and these kind of things. And the key problem, however, that we have is that if the intention of China is really to establish a regional or sub-regional hegemony, then clearly it will interpret the rules according to that objective. And then no matter how much we insist on, liberal rules-based order, which you might think in Southeast Asia is and East Asia is, let's keep it the way it was, it's not going to work. And so I think that insistence on rules-based, order might not be sufficient, because we will increasingly see concepts at work which we long have, at least in academic circles, discarded, such as balance of power and other forms of state behavior. I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but I think that's as best I can explain it.
Thank you. And Amy, and the legal basis for American presence?
So the short answer to that question is I don't know why it's not in the white paper. I'm an academic. I wasn't involved in drafting the white paper, and perhaps there are others in the room who can speak to that. But I think your comment is really interesting, or your question is a really interesting one, because it speaks back to what I was saying earlier about there being this perhaps increasing disjuncture. Japan, on the one hand, seeing the regional security order as kind of equal to the US-Japan Security Treaty, and that's been true since 1952. And it has been the most important kind of legal basis for the US forward deployment in Asia. That's absolutely true. Is that going to continue to be true? And I think that's where the question mark still is. I don't want to read too much into the absence of that from the white paper. I'd have to go back and look at previous white papers to see whether or not the US-Japan Security Treaty was mentioned. I can't remember off the top of my head. But perhaps there are others that can answer why it was explicitly left out if it was. Can I have a quick response to the first question as well? I think it's very important that the words liberal or democratic are not linked to rules-based order, because, of course, there are a number of countries who need to participate in shaping that order that are not democratic countries. And historically, we haven't required the democratic domestic character of a country to have a role in shaping regional architecture. And that's been that's the ASEAN way. It's the kind of the way that regional security architecture has always been shaped. And I think that's a very important principle.
Amy, maybe it's just timely for me to make a brief observation about your comment on Japan in the white paper, because I must confess I read it in a totally different way. When I look at the language on Japan in the white paper, I would describe it as barely disguised excitement at the possibility for what can be done in terms of bilateral and trilateral cooperation, barely disguised. But anyway, that's just a difference of perceptions. Now, I have three questions. Firstly, Paul Dibb, then there's a lady right at the back of the room, and then a person at the table after Paul. So over to you, Paul.
Oh, thank you, Peter, and if I may, a couple of observations. My experience with white papers is that one has to be very careful what one writes about foreign countries. As David knows, every embassy in this town takes out a ruler and measures how many paragraphs are written about them. I have every expectation to believe that this white paper had highly classified blunt advice on certain countries, and that's something we need to understand. This is the best defence white paper we've had, and I've been associated with them one way or another for over 30 years. I'm glad to see the bipartisan strong endorsement we got from the opposition today. Okay, they don't agree with everything, but at the essence and the core, thank God we now have a bipartisan approach. That was not always the case. This is a funded white paper. I'm not privy to the external funding, but people reassure me. Unlike other white papers, including the 2009 and 2013, this white paper has an extensive chapter on money. And that is a first, frankly. What things do I have some reservations with? Peter, this won't surprise you. I'm not charmed by the statement that the three strategic priorities, that is, 1, the defence of Australia, 2, Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, and 3, the broader Asia-Pacific and the global order, should all have equal weight when it comes to force structure priorities. You know, we should be focusing on the Eastern Indian Ocean, the whole of Southeast Asia, the whole of the South Pacific, and our southern approaches. That's 20% of the Earth's surface, a non-trivial task for 59,000 members of the ADF. And that brings me to a second observation. There are words, some reasonably careful, some not so careful, about how we can make a significant contribution globally. Well, I suppose that's like Tony Abbott's ambition to put 2,000 armed army troops on the MH17 crash site 30 kilometres away from 40,000 Russian troops. You know, every defence minister's door should have chiselled in letters of gold, there are limits to Australia's defence capacity and influence. It isn't to say that we can't make some contributions at distance, as we're seeing with air power in the Middle East. But we have to recognise where our priorities are, and all this discussion we've heard just now from the three panellists is we really need to focus on to our north, really need to focus. Finally, rules-based order. The difference between this part of the world and the Cold War is there are no counting rules for nuclear weapons, there are no arms control agreements on nuclear weapons or conventional weapons, and there are no widely agreed avoidance of naval incidents at sea agreement. That against a background of increasing militarisation and rearming and territorial and other disputes. So, David, I entirely agree with your analysis. The issue of whether Trump is going to come into power, I'll talk to you privately what the word Trump means in the Yorkshire dialect. It's quite rude. I just want finally to draw your attention that short of that, Trump, my concern is that what we have now is a challenge from two authoritarian continental powers, China and Russia, who are leagued together but not allied, but aligned in their dislike and hatred of the United States and what we stand for. Russia more than China. China's using coercion, as David has strongly more than implied, and Russia is actually using military force. So my nightmare short of Trump, and I didn't expect the white paper to address this as one sentence on Russia, my nightmare short of Trump is that Putin decides he's had enough of NATO on his borders, where the nearest NATO jet fighters to St. Petersburg are the distance from Canberra to Cooma. Ask me how we would respond to any other country's jet fighters in Cooma. I'll tell you how we would respond. And that Putin wants to repossess what he sees as rightful Soviet-era territory in the near abroad. And with no strategic intelligence warning, the Russians now can put 150,000 troops into any neighbouring country. Not against a fully armed NATO, but certainly within 48 hours to take over all the Baltic countries, for example. Estonia invokes Article 5. Attack on one is attack on all. A, what do we do in terms of our contribution to the global order? And secondly, America has to defend NATO. And we then, David, can forget the pivot to Asia. The Americans would focus war fighting in Europe. And we would have a potential geopolitical vacuum for China to take even more advantage of. I would welcome comments.
Paul, thanks. Russia, perhaps, should we had more than one sentence on Russia in the white paper?
It is clear that Russia also is into a Putinesque assertion, a stage of assertiveness. And I think Paul is right that the United States could easily be diverted in that area. I'm not sure about the primacy issue, but I don't, however, at this stage see some grand Sino-Russian alliance against the United States. It'll be much more subtle, if you like, than that.
Thank you. Now we go to the very back of the room.
Hi, I'm Darshana from the Observer Research Foundation in India. The Defence White Paper identified India as one of the key partners to work with in the region. And the earlier sessions today emphasized on Australia's reliance on the alliance system for its security, environment, as well as strategic interests. Now, given India's own viewpoint of the alliance and the need to distance itself from anything remotely connected to the alliance system, how do you see the India-Australia relationship progressing, and what, in your view, are the challenges in working with India in the maritime domain in the current security scenario? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, David, as you mentioned India, I'll throw to you first.
If I were in Delhi, I'd be asking exactly the same question in the opposite direction. My sense is that in recent years, India has been reassessing its position, particularly in relation to China. And my sense is, unlike in previous years, India is much more disposed to elements of military and other cooperation, which I think we would welcome. I don't actually think that Australia would be, and you're the person to answer this rather than me, but my sense is that I don't think Australia would be realistic at this stage in forming some grand alliance with India. However much we might like that, I don't think we'd be realistic. However, were India-China relations or other elements on the subcontinent and in the Middle East significantly threaten Indian interests, then it would be very interesting to see the extent to which India itself would begin searching for new partnerships and putting substance into those partnerships.
Ben, do you want to offer some thoughts?
Well, largely, I agree with David. I'm not an India specialist, but if I look at the little that I know, is I see an emerging great power with a perception of being that emerging great power that has no history of forming into any alliances, and that, of course, also has this idea of that, that it largely shapes the rules of the road in its immediate environment, and that if it looks at Australia, it sees an interesting, potentially good partner to work with, but a smaller power in terms of its power and potential. I also, as far as I'm aware, when it comes to those rules-based order that we've been talking about for more than an hour now, it seems to me that we are not always look eye to eye in terms of what exactly those rules are. For instance, when we're talking, I think Syria is a very interesting example where we had very different interpretations. Whereas Australia harshly criticized Russia for its decision to use force to support the legitimate Assad government, India, for instance, offered some, approval and some understanding for Putin's argument. So I think there is scope. There is certainly, a form for cooperation, but I do not see, that big quantum leap that would significantly upgrade the relationship anytime soon.
Although I think one of the most interesting bellwether relationships to watch is the surprisingly close India-Japan relationship and how that has grown as quickly as it has. Dino, you're next. Yep.
Thank you, Dino Jalal. I was former Deputy Foreign Minister of Indonesia. Amy, I agree with your point that whoever is president in the United States will not change China's behavior. But I do think that U.S.-China relations will be more contentious under Trump than under Hillary. And what worries me is the prospect of a Trump presidency leading to the decline of the U.S. diplomatic and political capital, not just in the non-Western world, but among U.S. allies. and the rise of anti-Americanism. And automatically, this may lead to the rise of China's diplomatic and political capital. And there'll be a lot of countries, I would imagine, which really doesn't necessarily want to get closer to China on political or strategic terms, but they may have to because they feel more uncomfortable with the Trump presidency. So that's one point. Second point is a Trump presidency will lead to a much more polarized world. There will be a jingoistic and narrow nationalism emanating from Washington that will make the world order much more vulnerable and insecure. I don't agree with one of the panelists who said that there will be an alliance between Indonesia and Australia simply because constitutionally we're not able to enter into any military alliance with any country. But I do see closer diplomatic relations with Australia, between Indonesia and Australia. In Trump presidency, for example, there will be more frictions between, I hope not, but I see it's very possible with the United States and the Islamic world. Some Middle Eastern ambassador who I spoke to said they prefer to be quiet now as they see the silly season in US politics. But once it actually happens, they're worried about what will happen in the relations between the United States and the Islamic world. And Indonesia can play a role there, as a power that can cushion the relations because we have our own credentials as the country with the largest Muslim population. And Australia too, I think, has a role. I think your friends in the region would expect in a Trump presidency not just to follow US lead, but to make sure that the US leads in the right way. So just those comments, thank you.
Thanks, Dino. Fortunately, there's no silly season ever in Australian politics. So, Amy first, then David, do you want, yeah?
I mean, all I would say is I basically agree with everything you've said, so there's not much I can say to disagree with that.
I also agree, and anything that develops the ability of Australia and Indonesia to work together on regional issues is much to be desired. I just want to, if I may, sort of say, can we just stop contemplating a Trump ascendancy for a moment? But we still have, I think, another issue that relates to the United States. We are predicating so much of our security necessarily on the United States. We do need to contemplate the fact that at some point, non-Trump factors, but a whole variety of other internal factors in the United States, they could be economic, they could be social or whatever, will see somewhat of a pullback and we were certainly worried about that with the Obama administration, somewhat of a pullback from this wholehearted support which they've provided through their alliance relationships within the region. And what that says to me is, yeah, look, we hope it won't happen, and let's work very hard to make sure it doesn't happen, but at the same time, one of the ways that we can do that is by Australia, Indonesia and other countries in the region, one, actually continuing to work together on this regional architecture because it does bring us together, even if it doesn't bring big powers in to make it perform the way we'd like it to. Secondly, from Australia's point of view, we should be doing and continuing to do everything and more to develop our relationship with ASEAN and to ensure that ASEAN develops, the ASEAN countries develop, and of course the leadership of Indonesia within that is hugely important.
Thanks, Ben.
Just a very quick point. I agree with David that we can stop speculating about Trump. Let's speculate about Clinton. I read a really interesting analysis the other day, American commentators speculating on how Clinton's policy towards China would look like. And the most interesting point out of that article for me was that commentators speculated that Hillary would actually be closely adhering Kissinger's advice on China, and she would actually turn to advisors very close to Kissinger. And if you know Kissinger's position on China, And if that is true, and might well be wrong, I'm interested to hear from our American colleagues in this room what they think, because they're so much closer to all of this. But if that's true, then those of us who wish a much tougher stance towards China might well be disappointed. And sort of the shifting power balance might actually not be going into ways that some at least would hope it does.
Call me a hawk, but surely the most obvious implication is that that 2% ceiling on defence expenditure starts to look like a 2% floor in terms of what is a credible expenditure from an Australian perspective. But I'm just editorialising a little bit there. Now, I have 3 questions. You're in the sort of halo of the light, so, but one here. Quite angelic.
Bob Love from Babcock. I think we're all in violent agreement that the Strategic Balancing Act that Australia has conducted over many years now between the largest trading partner, the second largest trading partner, and the guarantor of security since 1941 has been nothing short of marvellous. But it seems to me it's a bit like a 3-legged stool, and Australia's sitting on the top of it. And one of those legs is suddenly getting a lot longer and a lot bigger and destabilising that seat we have. Taking that analogy a bit further, I've got to say I agree to a certain extent with Professor Ben, and he's a bit of a doomsday scenario in terms of conflict. I think the danger of an accident is probably more dangerous than actual conflict. But there is a stage before that conflict which I think is a real threat to Australia, and this is where I'll get to the question, and that is the risk of America taking pretty strong economic sanctions against China, and indeed expecting their close allies to follow suit. With our alliance with our biggest trading partner, how do you think that would play out in Australia?
So let's start with Amy, some brief comments.
I think you're right that is a real concern. Sanctions is sort of at the extreme end, but what does concern me is a lot of the commentary coming out of the United States at the moment almost seems to be hoping for a Chinese economic decline, a Chinese economic collapse, that China's kind of investment in infrastructure and other initiatives will fail. We can't hope for that. A poor China is not a happy China. When China was weak and backward and developing, it was much more conflict-prone, much more likely to use military force. And our own economic prosperity and that of the United States and Japan all depends on a healthy Chinese economy. So I think you're right to raise that concern. For Australia, I think there's a key interest in making sure that the economic halves of the Asia-Pacific region continue to be stitched together, so that the TPP that has been led particularly by the United States, by Japan and others, and the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific and the regional comprehensive economic partnership coming out of East Asia, not so much Chinese-led, but coming out of East Asia, are linked together, are not exclusive, are not exclusionary. Unfortunately, they are moving apart from one another. And Australia, like Japan, who's a participant of both, has a real interest, I think, in making sure they stick together.
Thank you. Unless the others wanted to add, Anthony, you were next up.
Anthony Bergen from ASPI. I'd like to take advantage of David's presence on the panel to raise an issue that wasn't taken up by the panel in the context of China, and that's the intersection between foreign investment policy and security. I appreciate, David, you've been on the Foreign Investment Review Board for 3 or 4 months now. I'm not asking to rehearse the whole Darwin issue, but the broad question of the intersection between acquiring strategic assets in this country and in the region and security. I'd be interested in any thoughts, judgments you'd like to offer on that issue for us.
Now, David, it may appear otherwise, but I didn't put Anthony up to ask that question.
So. The Chair would like to offer some thoughts.
You're asking me to tread very closely to the close to the bone in terms of proprietary and my responsibilities on the FIRB, and answering your gently provocative question. Look, I think it is, given the publicity of recent times and indeed my own appointment to the board, is an indication that the government is keen to ensure that the security elements of any investment decision are taken into account when that decision is made. Now, this isn't actually new, the security elements of numerous investment decisions taken in the past, for example, the takeover of Optus by a Singapore state-controlled enterprise, raised a whole series of security issues which were dealt with at the time. You deal with these issues in terms of looking at the economic benefit, obviously, which is what the FIRB does, and the security issues in terms of how significant how realistic in the first place those security issues are, how significant they are, and then finally, if they are significant, can they be mitigated in any particular way? And that's where the Foreign Investment Review Board works very increasingly these days, closely with the relevant authorities and experts within the government, and reaches a decision to make a recommendation, because they don't make the final decision. Of course, that's in foreign investment, that's the responsibility of the Treasurer. They then rely on expert advice to make that decision. And the Treasurer, if he is seized of the matter, will of course take an investment decision with security overtones to Cabinet, or at least to the National Security Committee of Cabinet.
David, thank you. I have two questions. Jacob, second last.
Thank you. Jacob Traeger from CMAX Advisory. Thank you for all of the discussion so far. I have a question. Leaving aside the worst case scenarios of a Trump presidency or Russian antagonism as Paul outlined, even going with the more pessimistic view that Ben had out to 2025, 2030, China being more assertive and regional dynamics changing, what does that mean for Australia's Defence Force posture? What does that mean for what we require from the Australian Defence Force to achieve? Does the white paper set that out? Do we need more? Do we need less? Do we need a more self-reliant industry? Or should we engage more closely with other allies such as the United States? Love to hear your thoughts.
Ben?
Well, thank you. Give it a try, and I hope my other panelists will save me. So let's assume Trump and Clinton. It doesn't really matter, and we're going towards that more, shall we say, contested environment, which doesn't necessarily need to involve the nightmare scenarios that we outlined. I think the first thing, at least from my point of view, and you can crucify me now, I think any notion of defense self-reliance I find really difficult in this environment to think about. And I thought actually the 2013 white paper was much more honest about it, in that, as far as I recall, it says that for any other major military operation, other than, let's say, a stability operation in the Solomon Islands, we would, of course, rely on the United States for support. And I think that is even more true as we're going into a more contested Asia-Pacific environment. Will we make fundamentally strategic operational impacts? Probably not. Can we think about burden sharing in terms of an operational theater with the Americans? Probably yes, by, for instance, what Paul mentioned, focusing on parts of the Indo-Pacific Ocean, focusing on Malacca Straits. In terms of the force structure, well, that depends really on what it is that you would want to do, and what kind of operational scenario you deem plausible, realistic, and something that an Australian government might be willing to undertake. But I think, there is no doubt that when you look at the current force structure, it is already moving towards a more expeditionary force posture. At least that's my observation. I might be wrong, but I do not. I can't conclude in any other way. We are developing more capable ships with standoff position, etc., etc. And I think that moves towards the ability of making an important, what will always be niche contribution. If we are living in a world where the United States were no longer the ultimate security guarantor, then, well, as David said, all bets are on the table. And then, of course, our force structure would have to look quite different under certain circumstances. And then, quite frankly, the nuclear question would be on the table. And I can say this because I'm an academic.
Nuclear question. Amy, did you want to?
No, I don't work in Australia or capabilities, so won't try that one.
Look, I'll offer a couple of thoughts myself. One is that in working on these documents, the challenge is always to get yourself out of the now to really think about what the world will look like in 20 years' time. And it's one of the hardest things to do. One of the things I like in the current white paper is the emphasis on posture, that is to say what we do with the forces that we have now. But I do think looking at trends in our strategic environment, one of the challenges for us is the timeframes within which we can sensibly look to acquire that expanded maritime capability don't really match against the timeframes that we have to deal with the strategic challenges that are emerging in the region. It's very hard to see what a sensible way is around that, but I think that's the reality that we're in.
To the panel, thanks very much, Lieutenant Colonel Nick Floyd from Joint Force Analysis Branch in VCDF Group. 2 points, if I could, please. One is thank you very much for the panel discussion so far, and although recounting the topic, it actually looks at the Asia Pacific, and we've had a wonderful discourse about Asia. And indeed other parts of the world, but we may have glossed over the Pacific, and there are some real security challenges that I think we may need to address in that, and I'd like to draw each of the panel members on some of the challenges, both hazards and threats that are emanating from the Pacific at the moment. And the other one, which I guess goes back to the notion of the oft arrived at rules-based global order, and going past the individual great powers that are going to be part of that construct, I'd like to draw each of the panel members on their views on some of the multilateral institutions, in particular the United Nations and its future, into the next 2 or 3 decades, where that may go, its potencies, what underpins those potencies, and the likelihood of that as an institution, and its fellow travellers of the World Bank and others like that, to help us in maintaining those world orders and indeed their opportunities for evolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Good questions. I might go in reverse order. David, can I start with you on Pacific and other matters?
It is, I think, will be a continuing element in our strategic thinking that the countries of the South Pacific, with the best intentions in the world, will take a very, very long time to be able to be in any position to control their own security. And the alliance and the responsibilities of Australia and New Zealand in that area are not going away. And they're not going away from a security point of view, and they're not going away from a military-supported disaster relief point of view either. So we clearly need, in my view, to maintain capability in both those areas. The other concern that one has about the Pacific is whether or not countries are indeed susceptible to the blandishment of external powers or whatever, for whatever reason. And we've seen I suspect largely benign from a security point of view, Chinese expansion into the South Pacific countries. But their ability to be masters of their own houses in that sort of situation will continue to be a challenge, and will continue, in my view, to require strong support from Australia, from New Zealand, from the United States, and other, dare I say it, like-minded countries, but increasingly including from within ASEAN.
I would very much agree with David's comments on the South Pacific, so I won't add anything there. On the global multilateral institutions, what I would say is, yes, they will continue to be important, but they will need to reform if they want to remain relevant, and they've been very slow to do so. Emerging powers, not just China, but a range of emerging powers have lobbied for greater voting rights, for greater say within the World Bank, within the IMF, within the UN, in the case of Japan as well, and they have been remarkably slow to reform. So that's why we're seeing the emergence of new institutions to perhaps challenge or put forward alternative frameworks for cooperation. So those institutions need to reflect the regional reality.
Yeah, just a very quick point. I think I'm not so much worried about United Nations. I'm really more worried about the European Union, because the pressure on the European Union from all sorts of sides at this point of time is enormous, externally, but also particularly internally. I mean, if you see what's happening across also major European countries, the whole question about Brexit and what that might bring in terms of unrest, not the least to mention the possibility of Northern Ireland, but things like what happens in Hungary, what happens in Poland, what happens in France, but also so I think the stability of Europe, I think, is really essential and often overlooked, and we have taken that for granted. I mean, coming from Europe myself, would never have imagined that pressure and that sort of uncertainty about where the European Union is heading. I mean, coming from Germany, I mean, the discussion, the debate that you have in Germany right now, deep uncertainty about the fragility and the cohesion of the European Union and what to do about it. If the European Union really faces severe increased pressure of disintegration, the implications are significant for the world economy, for stability. So I am not lying awake at night thinking about the UN, because the UN is always the UN and it's always incomplete and it works in some areas and it doesn't work in other areas. I agree with Amy that it has to reform to some extent, but it's the EU that at this point of time really worries me.
Yes, I agree. I think Brexit pulls on a very dangerous thread as far as the rest of Europe is concerned, and I'm glad we were able to touch on that. Well, it's been a really fascinating set of conversations. We've covered a lot of ground. Interestingly, one thing that wasn't mentioned at all was terrorism, and I hope we get the opportunity to discuss that at some point over the remainder of the conference. But it's been three fascinating presentations and some really interesting discussion. Thank you to the audience for your active participation, and can you please join with me in thanking the speakers.